following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back when the Jints and the Bums played in New York. I've got Noel Hynd, the host. Alan Blumpkin is kind of under the weather this week. But Noel's here. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Network. And we're going to have some fun. How are you, Noel?
I'm okay, Ralph. How are you doing?
Not bad at all. It is the morning, and given that, mornings aren't necessarily our favorite time, but this seems to cheer us both up on Tuesdays when we get together. And
exactly.
I'm going to miss Alan today, but we'll struggle on talking ball, specifically your topic of pitchers back in the day.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell me what you had in mind with that?
Well, I don't think we had, we've spent a lot of time talking about the Dodgers and the Giants and, the Hodges and Mays and Bobby Thompson and hitting and everything. But there was some great pitching, some absolutely great pitching for those teams in the 1950s. They would never have been winning pennants without the great pitching. And I don't think we've mentioned those names quite enough. One thing I love to do on something that has to do with New York baseball is bring up the name of Sal Maglie, because first of all,
Barber, one of
Barber,
my favorites of all time.
It is my contention, and this is what I do to start. Well, first of all, Maglie, I believe, was the last man who pitched or who played for all three New York teams when they were in New York. So he basically has a special place for everyone, I think, in the pantheon of New York baseball. Now, granted, he was not with the Yankees for very long, but he did contribute. He was a great contributor to the Dodgers in 1956. They wouldn't have won that 56 pennant without him. And he was
a no-hitter, if I'm not mistaken. That
yes, he did. I actually, as was my habit of the day, had a radio on very softly in when I was supposed to be going to bed and getting up for school the next day. And he was pitching against a very weak Philadelphia team, but I guess they were like a fifth-place team. And they still had some good hitters on that team. They had Richie Ashburn, who could always lay down a bunt. But Maglie, even before that, as you know, pitched for the Giants. I actually do not remember him with the Giants, but my feeling is that Maglie was really, for a couple of years, as effective as anybody who ever pitched. From 1950 through 1952, so it's a 50, 51, 52 season, Maglie was something like 59 and 18. Can you imagine that? I mean, that is astronomical. That is like Koufax at his best. That is like Guidry at his best. That is, in terms of pitching techniques, moving it to a more modern era. It's like the way DeGrom pitches today. It's absolutely phenomenal, but really not too far behind Maglie in that era was Newcombe, who was something like 102 and 40 over maybe two or three. I guess it was from 1949 to 1956. 102
No, before
and
we
40.
get off Maglie to go to Newcombe, who's equally as interesting, let's talk a little bit about Maglie being what they called a Mexican jumping bean. Before, I think he jumped from the Giants to the Mexican League and was banned for a while. He learned the craft of pitching in the Mexican League, and when he was reinstated and came back, there were other pitchers. Max Lanier comes to mind, who jumped when offered a better deal. Remember how restricted salaries were back then, and he learned his craft in the Mexican League, and I just wanted to note that, and there you go.
Yeah. Maglie, I would have to say he had an unlucky career because he was not being treated all that well by the Giants, who were, in my opinion, a little bit of a confused organization in the mid-1940s. So they left many of their star players very vulnerable to the overtures that were being made by, blanking on the gentleman's name, the Pasquale brothers, who would travel around the United States with a suitcase filled with two things, pistols and money, which kind of summed up their approach to bringing ball players to Mexico. But they offered a lot of money to a lot of big stars, and some guys went. Some guys went and came back very quickly. I think Vern Stevens was one. But Maglie was tainted, and I think unfairly, by the Mexican League and by his association with it, and was banned from baseball, I believe, indefinitely by, I guess it was Ford Frick. And then when Danny Gardella, also of the New York Giants, who also had gone to Mexico, brought a lawsuit to try to attack the reserve clause, the players were reinstated, and I believe most of them received a small amount of money as compensation. But that is why Maglie disappeared, I guess, from 1946 to 1950 when he was reinstated, and then became a star pitcher for the Giants, as you say, having learned to pitch in a very, very tough league where people knocked you down, where people threw at your head, where people threw at your knees. And Maglie, from what I read about him, just learned, hey, if I want to compete in the National League, I got to be a tough ass. There's just no two ways around it. And believe me, he was one on the field, and I have never heard anybody say anything against him off the field. He was a gentleman, comported himself very well. If you go to YouTube, you can find him on What's My Line as a mystery guest. And he, being a New York player, appeared on a couple of TV shows also. And you can kind of get a grip on the fact that he was a good guy, but had this veneer of toughness that he sort of had to show it. He had a great game face, and wasn't shy about using it to assemble a record like I mentioned earlier with all of those wins against so few losses.
And I mentioned he was nicknamed the Barber, and that wasn't just because he had a real thick beard that would grow in, and he'd leave it for the game to look more intimidating. He was intimidating. He brushed you back like a ball.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that was he was a lot like Drysdale.
Yes.
Could not dig in against Sal Maglie, or you would be plunked. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And
I think they
became a pitching coach with the Seattle Pilots, who became the Milwaukee Brewers. But it was Jim Bouton's book that kind of brought them to light in the history of baseball. But and Bouton didn't speak that highly of Sal. But nevertheless, he was the pitching coach back then. And, for a 10-year-old, when he was traded to the Dodgers from the Giants, that was like a big shock. First major player that I grew up. You know, I was a Giant fan from a very, very early age, and I got to love that guy, and they traded him. And then when he did pitch the no-hitter, I just, as a kid, I just didn't know how to react. I didn't know how to feel good for him yet. If he did it today, I would have, you'd say, well, good for him. It's, he's traded. It wasn't his fault. But as a kid, when your player gets traded to the Dodgers, you feel differently if you grew up a Giant fan in New York.
Oh, absolutely. Don't forget, there was a brief stay in Cleveland
Yes.
when the Giants cut him loose and he went to the Indians. And the Indians, from what I've read, Maglie could never figure out why the Indians even acquired him, because they weren't going to use him. And then later in 1956, they weren't using him. And it's funny, I had the pleasure very recently when I was writing a book on the Dodgers, the final game at Ebbets Field, to talk to Carl Erskine. And Erskine remembered Buzzy Bavasi coming to him, since Erskine was the player rep on the Brooklyn team at the time, and saying, we have a shot at getting Maglie from Cleveland. And
I forgot that he didn't go directly to the Dodgers.
Everybody
first.
People never expected to hear from him in New York again, because he was like the odd guy out in the Cleveland rotation. He did have an injury, but from what his son mentioned to me one time, the team doctors were misdiagnosing the injury, and it was a back injury, I believe, and he went to his family doctor in upstate New York in the off season, and whatever it was got better. He then came back to Cleveland, and they weren't using him because they were convinced he was still injured. Anyway, Bavasi said to Erskine, Sal does not have a lot of friends in this clubhouse because he's hit a lot of people. How do you think the Dodgers would react? What do you think about getting him? And Erskine says, is he healthy? And Bavasi says, apparently he's healthy. And Erskine says, get him. So Maglie then had this scene where he's got, if you think it was tough to watch your favorite player go over to the other team, imagine that guy walking in by himself to the enemy clubhouse, waiting to see what the reception was going to be. And apparently Carl Furillo, who he had hit a couple of times, takes a look at him and sort of grudgingly smiles, offers a hand, and says, welcome, Pazan, and let's go get him. And if Furillo didn't have a grudge, nobody was going to have a grudge. So that part of the story is kind of cool, because as soon as Maglie...
I don't know where I read this. There was a dinner that the teammates went to, and Maglie was a new teammate, and there was something about, he didn't fit in right away. Let's put it that way. It just didn't totally fit in right away. And I'll come up with that story. It's off the top of my head now, but I read it somewhere, and it was very interesting about the dynamics, because teammates would be teammates. Now you go to you stand outside of the player gate, and you get 25 cabs for 25 different guys. Back then, they take buses, trains, it wasn't travel by plane. You would be in close proximity, and a teammate was a teammate then. It was like being in the service, or in a fraternity club in college or whatever, and it brings a closeness for whatever reason that doesn't happen today. In today's world, that's one of the things that we can distinguish the times we're talking about from the way things are. That's why it's a pleasure to go back in our memories, because they were indeed not perfect. There were better times. I'm just saying. I'm not an old fogey, but but then again, I'm an old fogey. So what can I tell you?
Anyway,
no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to.
You want to talk more? You want to get into Nuke, one of my favorite characters in the world, and I'm a
I was very. I was sorry to see that he passed away recently.
Yeah. Lived a good life. He was revered. I guess that's the word, by the players of today, because the Dodgers kept him on the payroll all these years as kind of a father figure. That's the best way I could explain it. Does that come close?
I would think so. Some teams, it's nice to see when they do this, they keep guys around just so some of the younger players can maybe pick up a little bit of the history of the team. Heaven knows some of them arrive at certain teams and they don't know too much about it. I'm not sure how many times I've heard the story about people arriving at the Yankees and asking for number 7 or 5 or something like that, and it has to be explained to them that that one's not in use anymore.
I don't think you'll be getting that one.
You used to see Newcombe around Dodger Stadium. I think in the last couple of years he got on the frail side, but heaven knows the man was in his 90s. And as Bruce Springsteen once said to Pete Seeger, well, look, you've outlived most of your enemies. So Newcombe was quite a pitcher. I have to admit, when I was a kid, I didn't like him because he tortured the teams that I like. I loved the Cardinals for a while. Whenever I could watch Musial play, I would. And Newcombe had a long winning streak. It might have been like 16 games in a row against the Cardinals. They could not hit the guy with a barn door. And I remember, I guess it was in 1957 when the Cardinals were, for 1 year at least, a resurgent team. They finally beat Newcombe in St. Louis. And back then, the standard practice of a game, which somehow got lost over the years, was the public address announcer after the game would announce final score, and he would also announce winning and losing pitchers. And the whole crowd in St. Louis stayed in the ballpark just so they could applaud losing pitcher Newcombe, now 12-7 or whatever he would have meant at the time. So it was he was a tough pitcher. I believe there was one team in the league that had a winning record against him, and I think it was the Milwaukee Braves, which would make sense because they were a very, very good team after 1955 or so.
Oh, they were a terrific team. As deep a team as we've ever seen in baseball, like in 1958. If you go down their lineup and what they had coming off the bench, Frank Torrey and Felix Mantilla and Del Rice.
And Frank Torrey was a backup guy too, because Joe Adcock was at first base.
Right, they platoon a little bit. Torrey was very underrated defensively. He was just it was just a very solid team. They picked up Red Shandingst after a while to solidify second, and Johnny Logan was as solid as they come, to go along with Aaron and Matthews, who are Hall of Famers, and Spahn and Burdette and McMahon in the bullpen. I really had a lot of respect for that 1950s Milwaukee team. And as a footnote to that team, I think 11 years. They moved in 64. They got there in 53 from Boston, and they moved in 64. So I could be off a year either way. They never had a losing season. Conversely, the A's, who had moved from Philadelphia to Kansas City and spent roughly the same amount of years, never had a winning season. So
yeah,
some fans end up being lucky fans. I ended up being a Met fan.
well, going back to Kansas City and Milwaukee, I never realized this. Milwaukee never had a losing season. Kansas City A's never had a winning season, and both teams moved anyway. So go figure.
Exactly. Both teams moved twice in there.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I'm sure the Braves are much more secure in Atlanta than the A's are in Northern California. I can assure you.
Yeah, you would know very well since you're right up in that area.
I'm right there. They're having a lot of trouble. They're trying to build a new stadium. I don't know how long Major League Baseball is going to let them continue to ride. They're trying to put it together. They have been rebuffed once, and there's a great public outcry, neighborhood outcry, to rebuff them for their second choice, because it's a neighborhood that doesn't call for gentrification, and it doesn't call for easy access to get in and out of there by car. And that's going to doom that. They're going to have to go back to the site that they're playing at now, which would be idyllic. All the public transportation is in force. The BART, which is the railroad, backs right up to it. And they'll end up building a ballpark if it goes down. They'll end up building a ballpark in the parking lot and tearing down the parking lot, tearing down the existing stadium and building a parking lot.
So sort of like what the Mets did, in other words.
Exactly. You build a stadium right next door, and it saves. And the big problem in California is environment, and rightfully so, God knows, is environmental studies, which the word isn't even talked about nationally. They're shutting down the EPA and everything, but needs to be done to keep from spoiling the environment. That wouldn't have to be done on this site, on the existing site. So it'll come to that, but in the meantime, they've gone through a lot of bad problems. The city and the county, which make the decision, the County of Alameda and the City of Oakland make joint decisions. They've never been good to existing sports franchises vis-a-vis the Oakland Raiders, and what used to be the Golden State Warriors. They'll be renamed the San Francisco Warriors, because San Francisco's where they'll be playing from here on out.
That's okay. Let me ask a stupid question. Where do the Warriors play right now?
They play at the Oakland Coliseum, which is adjacent to at the Oakland Arena. I think they call it the Oracle Arena or something.
Where did the
game every 20 minutes, and it's they share a parking lot with the baseball team. They're right next door. And now they're going to be moving to San Francisco. big downtown arena that's they simply outbid them, and the arena will be filled with music and other venues. They'll try to make up for it, but it won't be the same for sure.
What is the where are the Raiders going to land?
They've already landed in Las Vegas.
Okay, so this is going to be their first season in Las Vegas?
No, I think they have a year or two left on the contract in Oakland.
Oh, okay. So that's my point. They're
right.
Still in Oakland, but it's a done deal. They're going to land in Las Vegas.
It's a done deal. They're lame ducks, and every time I talk to a Raider fan, I will always ask the same question: why anyone supports them at this point? They moved once. When they came back, they insisted on destroying the Coliseum, making it a football stadium, taking away the beauty, the openness of a baseball stadium. It wasn't the best, but it was still a nice place to go out, and they enclosed it. They put what they call Davis's wall or whatever, and then they turn around and move again, which so for a fan, I was bitten as a fan as a 10-year-old when the Giants and Dodgers moved. Bitten once, but Raider fans bitten twice, and some of them kids as well, and sometimes it's their kids that their kids watching the game, losing the team. I mean, it's never.
Yeah.
Cities should have eminent domain on their teams, and I don't know if you got into that in your book, if that was ever discussed in those days, but it's a truism. It would save a lot of problems, a lot of broken hearts. Put it that way.
Yeah, the sports teams have always fallen into a somewhat gray area of the law. They've gotten friendly treatment from governments and cities, and they claim they're private enterprise, and then they turn around to the city and say, we want money for a stadium. They want socialism when it befits their capitalism. Let's put it that way.
Right.
But...
Yeah, And most people don't understand the word socialism. When you said socialism, half the audience, half the people listening probably went, "Oh, socialism." Socialism is being an FDR Democrat.
Yeah.
That's all. I don't know where the word got this. Why it's confused with communism. Maybe because of an Issuism, and people, it's just not communism. It's socialism, where everybody takes care of one of another. Not by design, only because people need taken care of. We'd love it if they didn't. We'd love it if we didn't have to worry about it. But you know what? Humanity is humanity. That's what it means. And while we're on it, back when in the day we talked about, no one was talking about changing the poem on the Statue of Liberty that overlooked that city. And now they are. And if that doesn't describe the differences between the days that we talk about and the days of today, nothing will. Is that
absolutely.
Just as somebody brings it up, has the nerve to bring it up, and to imagine bringing that up to my grandfather,
or to
he'd hit you with a shovel.
Yeah.
And rightfully so. And his neighbors would jump in.
Yeah.
It was just the spirit of New York. It's a melting pot, and I was led to believe growing up that was the spirit of the country. It everything came through New York, and boy, it certainly isn't the spirit of the South. Certainly isn't the spirit of the Midwest. Anyway, it's a tough world.
Yeah, and the Statue of Liberty is in New Jersey anyway. You know that, right?
Yeah, that's probably true. Technical. You're gonna technical me? You're gonna technical me?
Well, it's New York Harbor. Oh, I was
yes,
35 when I finally learned the Statue of Liberty is in New Jersey. It was sort of. I'm not even sure most people knew that for a long time. It's a very moot
point. I'm sure
point.
I knew it, but when you said it, I didn't act shocked, but I knew it. But it's easy to forget.
Yeah, it's sort of like Kansas City Airport, I think, is in Kansas or something like that, even though the city is in Missouri. Well, it's like LaGuardia. Right. It's a New York airport, but it's not LaGuardia, but Newark. It's a New York airport, but it's in New Jersey.
It is in Newark, New Jersey, coincidentally.
Yeah.
And LaGuardia is where, as a kid in those days, I would take my bicycle, and Marty Rose from this network, my boyhood friend, we would take our bikes down to LaGuardia. It was maybe 8 blocks away, and they had an observation deck, and you'd go up on the observation deck, and they had these high-powered binoculars or whatever, and you tune into the pilots talking, and you'd hear them, watch them land the plane, and hear them talking, and that's how close Jackson Heights. That's how close I was to LaGuardia Airport. You could not sleep for 20 minutes without a plane coming over your head. You had to adjust to that, and it was an easy adjustment when I enlisted in the Air Force, and wherever I was stationed, there were planes coming over all the time. Never bothered me. So there you go. Have I rambled enough on one podcast? Have I ruined this whole thing?
Well, it's partly my fault. I let you do it because I was fascinated with what you had to say. Just as a footnote to that, could you imagine if you went out with binoculars right now and started to watch planes taking off? You'd be arrested.
Oh, absolutely. I wrote a joke. I don't know if you know, I did comedy for a long time, and I recently wrote a joke that says, the air marshal understood when I was screaming out, I want the plane to go down, I want the plane to go down. He understood when he found out I was seated in between a born-again and a vegan.
Yeah.
So,
shoot me now, right?
Shoot me. Take the plane down. I've had enough. Let's finish off on Nuke. What's the thing that stands out in your mind about him more than anything else?
About Don Newcombe?
Yeah.
Yeah. What stands out in my mind is a very personal thing, and it harkens back to what I was talking about before. 1956 was one of the first years that I followed baseball, and 1956 was, I believe, the year that Newcombe was something like 27-7. And I just remember watching Dodger games that year, and I can remember why he won 27 games. I just can't figure out how he could have lost 7. He was just an overpowering pitcher that year. I think somehow Milwaukee might have beaten him like 3 or 4 times that year. And then, the Cubs in a fluky game. Cubs were terrible. But basically, when the Dodgers sent Newcombe out that year, he was going to win. The only question was whether he was going to also hit a home run, because he was a hell of a great hitter also. I think he had one year he may have had 5 or 7 home runs. So Even when he's pitching, he's got an extra bat in the lineup also. So it was a pretty lethal combination. So Newcombe in 56, I believe he won the Cy Young that year. One of the most dominant single years for a pitcher I've ever seen. It sort of reminds me of later on when I got to watch Gooden in his first year and Guidry in his great year in the 70s, and Sandy Koufax when he was something like 21-4. Newcombe was always the gold standard that I could remember.
Now, was 56 the year that the Yankees beat him up in the World Series?
I believe so, because that was always the rap on Newcombe, that, he could get them into the World Series, but he could never win in the World Series.
Right, I remember Yogi Berra hit him around pretty well, and the rumor was that as the result, his alcohol intake increased, and that led to his demise as a pitcher.
Well, I don't know whether it was cause and effect, but he did have problems with drinking. He was 0 for 4 in the world as a World Series pitcher, by the way. And in 1956, he was 0-1. But he got beaten up pretty badly. I'm just looking right now at an ERA line for him. It's very possible. You had to realize also, we forget about it now, but there was more pressure on players of color if they didn't perform. And there was, so you always had that racial thing going on that the white guys really didn't have to worry about. So I imagine there was a lot of pressures going on. You mentioned this stuff to young baseball fans who are in their 30s or even their 40s today, and you start talking about a time when black players, African American players, had to stay at different motels in Florida for spring training. They look at you and say, "Why?" And it's because the damn place was segregated. They wouldn't allow black people, African American, colored as the term was at the time. They just wouldn't allow them to stay there. And that's, people say, why not? Well, it's a good question. That's what a lot of people should have been asking at the time. But I don't think there's anything more complicated about the United States than race relations. So it's another subject, and yet it enters into absolutely everything.
And it isn't something that happened then and ended. It's the same on certain levels, overt and covert notwithstanding, that it was back then. So we still have not solved it, and we're still as radically polarized on it as we were back then. It's crazy.
Yeah, if not even worse, because up until recently, at least the overall aspiration of our elected leaders, particularly the one in the White House, there was a general acknowledgement, I guess, at least since Nixon, that it wasn't real. You might be a racist, you might be a bigot, but it really wasn't the right thing to do. And now all the signals are, oh yeah, it's just fine. We pay panders for those votes. So
the enormity of the office used to bring a president who was to the left closer to the middle, because the enormity, he knew he was the president of everyone. And if he was left wing, he'd go closer to the middle to please the right wing, because he had to please everybody. And this guy doesn't care about pleasing anybody, either way. And I'll tell you, if there's the mystery of today, I know this is off baseball, I can't understand why an evangelicist Christian could support this man. what is it about? What am I missing? Can you explain that?
Well, I could put forth a rather ugly theory. Why don't I do that? I
Please.
think a lot of people are just insincere Christians, and you scratch the surface and they're bigots. And I'm not saying all of them. Send the letters to Ralph, not to me. But there are some who are just bigots, and it appeals to their bigotry. How else do you explain it? And how else do you keep excusing this guy?
And should there be an Amendment 25? Because he's doing things now. I'm not a mental health expert, but he's doing things now that, like, if it were my neighbor, I'd have him get some help. I'd send help his way.
Well, a lot of the things he says in public, you'd be fired for if you said them at work. I mean, you just start.
And you'd be divorced for if you said them at home. You'd be divorced, or you'd be despised. You'd by your neighbors. How could you think that? How could you say that? You'd think. And I have one more question for you, because you're a member of the media. How could they continue to cover this man? Why don't they just say, why cover a guy if he's lying to you half the time? And why not just say every time, well, this is what you say now, this is what. Why don't they stand up to him? That's not, Mr. President, that's not what you said this morning. I don't hear questions like that from the news media. Why do they cover? Why do they insist on covering them? Is it just their corporate greed that it's interesting to the public? It's good ratings. I mean, we may be being ripped off by the media if they continue to cover this, crazy. What they know is lies. What they know is to be bullshit, and they have to listen to the same lies every day. Yes, thank you, Mr. President.
Do you remember how Ted Koppel used to conduct an interview and people come out and they'd avoid a question, and Koppel would say something like, well, you've articulated a few points very well, but unfortunately, sir, you didn't answer my question, so I'm going to ask it to you again. Why did such and such and such and such? I would just love to see exchanges like that. But I guess this particular White House would lift your press pass pretty fast and claim you were being one-sided or non-objective. They constantly accuse the other side of doing exactly what they do themselves.
Good, very good point. And there's another good adage that you can't beat Republicans with Democrats. They just, with all good intentions, they just find a way of messing it up when it comes to stuff like that. I mean, we had the Mueller report. The Mueller report comes out, 3 months ago by now?
Mm-hmm.
We don't hear very much about that. How is it that these subpoenas aren't being met, and that there isn't a quick court resolution to it? Shouldn't these cases be put right at the top? McCann and what have you testifying? I don't understand it. I'm just as my friend Dewey says, getting curiouser and curiouser.
Uh-huh.
All right. Hey, Noel, we get off on tangents, but this is fun.
It is indeed.
All right. Same time next week, I hope.
Yes. Let's do that. Our normal meetup is on Tuesday, and let's keep it that way. That works very well for me, as long as it works for you.
It does indeed. I hope to have Al Blumpkin back next week. And stay healthy, my friend.
Same to you, and we will talk a week from now. Take care.
That'll be great. Thank you for listening, everybody. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Adios. The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.